Welcome back to our study on the Gospel of Mark. This week we are in Mark 6, verses 30 through 56. Um, Here we pick up the story of Jesus' disciples returning to him after he sent them out to proclaim the gospel. You'll remember in the last video that Jesus has sent out his disciples to preach, and then we are interrupted by Herod killing John the Baptist, and now we get the return of Jesus' disciples who are just glowing, absolutely glowing about what happened and um, how they accomplished the task that he sent them out for. So here we have John the Baptizer is silenced only to be replaced by 12 disciples of Jesus. The person who was proclaiming Jesus is now replaced by a group of people proclaiming Jesus. We also see that they had a great time, and now we get to see who Jesus is according to different people. Um, we should also point out that while in Luke, Jesus has a few words to say to the disciples about Satan falling, we don't see that here. Mark is very matter of fact, just that the disciples returned and that they had a glowing account. Um, and Jesus then responds with, "Come away with me, get away by ourselves." He really says, "By yourselves, go away into a deserted place, get away for some rest." Jesus apparently sees a need that after they have been ministering to other people and proclaiming the gospel to other people, these disciples need to recharge their batteries, uh, reconnect with God, and the best way to do that is in a deserted place. But the crowds end up following Jesus. This is, again, a little bit of an indication of how successful the disciples are, that they seem to have brought the crowds with them, and then the crowds run ahead. Now, um, it is really, this is kind of a literary technique as much as historical detail, where Mark is really selling how great of a job the disciples did, how effective their preaching was, and how badly the crowds wanted to see Jesus. Um, so Jesus gets away. Jesus and the disciples try to get away, but then what we almost get the picture of is Jesus and the disciples putting out into the lake in the boat and trying to sail around the lake, and the crowd walking the shore, watching that boat, watching for when it starts to make towards land so that they can get to the spot that Jesus and his disciples are going to be. And this is kind of the all-day event. Jesus has apparently prearranged with his disciples to come back at a certain point, and when they all get back, the crowds are there, they're watching, and they're following Jesus. And here Jesus gets to the sea, or gets to the shore, and sees them as sheep without a shepherd. Now, this is pretty important language right here. We're going to get into the feeding of the 5,000, which is the only uh, one of the only acts of Jesus that is recorded in all four Gospels. Apparently, this was a very big deal for early Christians, that Jesus would feed 5,000 people, and how Jesus did this, and all of the things that go into it. But what we notice right away is this language of sheep without a shepherd. This becomes very prominent language in the Christian life. The idea of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, from John, is vital to how Christians saw Jesus. This also brings in some analogies to Psalm 23. We're going to see Jesus as the shepherd guiding his sheep, which famously Psalm 23 talks about, and also the idea of provision of a table in the midst of the wilderness, which is very similar theme to, again, Psalm 23. So you should, if you get a chance, read Psalm 23 and then go read this section of Mark where you see Jesus feeding the 5,000 and the overlays between the two of them. There's a lot of parallel language here. But Jesus sees this as sheep without a shepherd. They are just wandering. But these people came with a purpose. Even though these people in their minds came with a purpose to see Jesus, Jesus still sees them as wandering, as aimless, as needing direction. and he teaches them. Even though he is trying to get away, he and his disciples are trying to to find a place by themselves. But then he starts to really uh, to look to the disciples and try to get them to understand his ministry and who he is. Because as the day wanes on, he says to the disciples, hey, they've been here all day. They've been listening. They've had a long walk. Go get them something to eat. And the disciples kind of respond to Jesus, um, where? Where are we supposed to get these people something to eat? They talk about 8 or 9 months of salary could not find enough food for these people. How are we supposed to scare that up in the desert? The 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 emphasis is not on the amount of money that it would cost, um, even though it's a large sum of money. The disciples are saying this is a large sum of money, but even more significant is where where are we going to get the food? This is a deserted place. The idea is kind of like, even if we had the money, we're not in the middle of Jerusalem where there's plenty of food. Where can we find something to eat? And this is what we uh, what we see here is um, Jesus trying to show the disciples provision. Again, go back to that Psalm 23 motif of being in the darkest valley, having a table set in the midst of the enemies. Even when you're in the wilderness and you're in the deserted area, the times where there's nothing, you have something. If this was Matthew's gospel or Luke's gospel, we could talk about how Satan tempted Jesus in the wilderness to turn stones into bread, and here Jesus is in the wilderness turning stones into bread. But that doesn't really, or at least figuratively turning stones into bread, making food in the middle of the wilderness. Let's put it that way. Jesus here, in one sense, does exactly what he is tempted to do in the desert for himself. He does it for others. Um, but that's Matthew and Luke, not Mark. Mark just has Jesus saying he wants to show the disciples who he is and how he can interact with this world. These people who have seen Jesus calm the storm, throw thousands of demons out of people, he has healed major diseases. They still don't understand Jesus is the one who can provide life and sustenance for people, which includes food. Um, we also should notice that unlike John's gospel, the disciples have the food. Um, they have they have 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's what they have. John's gospel has Andrew getting 5 loaves and 2 fish from a small boy. Um, the other gospels don't record that detail. Not to say that it didn't happen. It's just it's something that's omitted here, and we shouldn't again read into the fact that it's not here, or we shouldn't read that into this story. We should let Mark tell Mark's story. So the 5 loaves and the 2 fish are brought forward by the disciples, and Jesus says, have everybody sit down in groups. Now, here we have the disciples providing food for 5,000 men from their own stockpile. Exactly what Jesus asked them to do. Jesus said, find them something to eat. The disciples go back to their own food and find something for these people to eat out of their own stores. Isn't that something? Jesus has said to them, you go provide them, and the disciples, whether they realize it or not, are providing for these people. Now, it is becoming increasingly common in a world that does not do well with miracles for scholars to talk about how the miracle Jesus actually performs is getting people to share, and that when Jesus had them sit down in table fellowship, People pulled out their own provisions and ate and shared, and abundance was collected. And I'm not here to overly criticize that interpretation, other than to say uh, there is nothing in the text itself to suggest that. The text is very sparse on details and just says Jesus provided for them. Um, Here we have Jesus taking the bread, breaking the bread, blessing the bread, and distributing the bread. This is all language that will come up later in Jesus' Last Supper. So here we see Jesus providing communion, essentially, for all of these people. Now, we have to again recognize that these are very common verbs, but the fact that all four of them are here and then in the Last Supper seems to indicate that Mark wants us to draw that parallel between this large meal and that rather small, intimate meal. People have gathered. Jesus is going to provide food for them from what the disciples are able to bring to the table. Again, we saw in the last video that Jesus was not able to do great works in Nazareth because the people were cold and did not willingly participate with him. Here, the disciples do willingly participate despite concerns and not knowing where it's going. And what Jesus is able to do is provide a large feast for everybody out of that. So we do want to take that. We want to remember that. He directs people to sit. They sit down in groups of 50 and 100. That's going to come back in a minute. And then he passes out food, and the disciples collect 12 baskets, one for each of them. Again, a number of completion, a number of the leftovers were enough for everybody. That Jesus provided more than enough. Jesus provided everything. So again, it's not simply that the disciples collected it. This is the symbolic number of showing that Jesus fulfilled everything that they could have asked for. Some people do make a little bit of a deal between the size of the basket collected here and then the miracle of the 4,000. I don't think that the gospel writers are really that concerned with the size of the basket. I know some scholars try to really emphasize that, but I just don't see where they are, why they're making a big deal of it. So I'm going to just skip over it. But what's important here is, I think, the fact that Mark talks about 5,000 men, and he makes a distinct point of this. He does not talk about women and children. The word he uses, typically the standard word in Greek, anthropos, would have been human or people. He doesn't use that. He actually specifically says there were 5,000 men. Matthew will add in there were 5,000 men besides the women and children. Mark does not give us that detail. And it seems like it is possible that, again, look at what the disciples have been proclaiming. They have been going through the countryside proclaiming that God's kingdom has come, God's reign and rule is here, and 5,000 men show up. John makes this a lot more explicit, where John says that the 5,000 were trying to make Jesus king. What it seems like is the disciples went through the countryside proclaiming the message that Jesus is bringing in God's reign, and people understood that as Jesus is going to start a war, and they show up as an army. That's completely within the possibility here. I think Mark kind of implies that this is an army that has shown up to make Jesus their king. That's why they're sitting in groups of 50s and 100s. Those are typical military divisions in the Hebrew Bible. And we see it played out here, that these people show up, they sit in groups of 50s and 100s as military units. They are trying to make Jesus their king and to put him at the head of an army. Instead, Jesus feeds them and sends them on their way. That's kind of an important detail for us, that Jesus had the opportunity to use military force and didn't. It's not explicit in the text, but Mark does imply that the disciples went out and started talking about Jesus's reign, and then suddenly 5,000 men turn up and no women to be found, or at least no women mentioned. And again, that's kind of confirmed by John, where they say they want to make him their king. Jesus instead, he dismisses everybody. He dismisses the crowd. He gives them a meal and says, go, leave. He dismisses his disciples. They start to cross the sea. Jesus wants to be alone, completely alone. Again, this goes back to the start of what we talked about earlier, where Jesus says to the disciples, you have done great work. Now you need to take time to recharge. Jesus is putting that into practice himself, where he's done work and now he needs to take time to recharge. How he expects to catch up to the disciples who are crossing the sea and meet back up with them, well, that's not told to us in the text. Obviously, Jesus could have easily met up with his disciples, made plans to meet up with them, and said, hey, you go over there, I'll meet you there on this day at this time, and we'll meet up. That's not a very big detail there. And I can see why the disciples would be like, okay, you're going to stay here for a day or two. That's fine. We'll catch up with you later. You have plenty of food to eat. You'll be fine. So that's not unreasonable for the disciples to just leave Jesus and go across to the Gentile side of the sea there. Jesus probably told them, hey, you need to get your rest too, so you go on ahead. But then Jesus decides, for whatever reason, to cross the sea and do so by walking. Again, many scholars today, well, not many, but a few scholars today are trying to downplay this miracle as Jesus was walking on a sandbar or other sorts of explanations. The text doesn't really say that. What the text seems to show is Jesus walks on the water as if it were dry land. And what Mark seems to want us to see and want us to recognize in all of this is that to Jesus, the world around Jesus conforms to Jesus's ideas. It's not so much that Jesus is just showing off. It's that the world around Jesus conforms to Jesus. If Jesus needs to walk across the sea will comply. If Jesus tells the wind and the waves to stop and to settle down, they listen. If Jesus needs food, food is there. Jesus is not confined to the traditional rules of the world because the world wants to help Jesus. That's what we are trying to see here. And on top of that, Jesus's disciples have to encounter what that means. So they are starting to see where you had Nazareth, who was Jesus is a provincial, he's a nobody. Why should we listen to him? And Herod, who is Jesus is an evil spirit, or at least a spirit come to harass me. Jesus is somebody who's just there to harass me and to point out my deeds. The crowds are there because Jesus is the king and we need to make him the king. The disciples now are in this position where they have seen the demons listen. They have seen the wind and the waves listen. They have seen the material food listen. Now they are watching him walk on water. They are encountering something completely different. And John has now hit kind of the high mark of, or well, kind of the high mark. We're going to see in a couple of chapters that there's one more high mark to reach. But as far as Jesus' demonstrations of power, the disciples have now seen everything. They have seen Jesus pretty much do everything and seen the world conform to him. And now they are asking, who is this guy? And you can understand their fear, not simply because, somebody is walking on the water out towards them, but even when they recognize who Jesus is, there's got to be a little bit of an intimidation of what's going on in the world around me, because this isn't right. And so Jesus, Jesus crosses, and they pick him up, and they cross over to the Gentile region. Now, this again is important. We're seeing Jesus kind of mimic chapters 4 and 5, where in chapter 4, Jesus teaches, does some healings. We see that, all of that, and then he crosses over in chapter 5 and casts out a demon. Here we have Jesus doing a lot of stuff on the Jewish side of the sea, and he's done some miracles. He's sent out the disciples, and then he crosses over to the Gentiles side of the sea, where he is met by a crowd of people who want healing. They want to interact with Jesus. Now, it is both possible, but an overstatement, to say with certainty that the former demoniac that we met in chapter 5 is the cause of this. But it does seem like Mark wants us to at least think about that, because Jesus has gone from the demoniac, come back to the Jewish side, worked exclusively on the Jewish side of the sea, and then comes back after he had told the former demoniac to go back to his hometown and spread the word. Suddenly Jesus is met with a bunch of people who need healing. It seems like people listened to the demoniac. It's an overstatement to say that with certainty, but it does seem like Mark is implying that the demoniac spread the message of his healing, and many people showed up. And you notice now that they're asking to touch the fringes of Jesus's clothes, because that's what the woman who had the bleeding issue from the last chapter, that's what she did. She touched the fringes of his clothes, and he healed her. So Mark is here relaying how the events of chapter 5 are snowballing to even the point where the Gentiles are starting to come and hear Jesus. So we are starting to go, who is Jesus? We have a lot of different possibilities. People are saying that he's Elijah or a prophet or John the Baptist resurrected somehow. Pilate's saying he's John the Baptist resurrected. People in Nazareth are saying he's a nobody. But what we're also seeing, what we are confronted with as the readers, are all of the things that are going on around Jesus, where crowds are coming to him because of the preaching. He's doing signs and wonders. Miracles are happening. This all is meant to culminate in the idea of who is Jesus. And in the next chapter, we'll see Jesus heal a blind man, and that is where where we as the reader, not just as Jesus healing the blind man as a historical act, it's also meant to show us as the reader, now we're ready to see who Jesus truly is, because we've understood all of these things that have led us up to this point. So I hope you're having fun reading along. As always, if you have questions or comments, please leave them for me. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And until we meet again, God bless.